Hello, everybody. This is John Brodeur. I'm in Boston. Welcome to the webinar, and thanks for joining us. We hope all of you are coping well. This is really kind of a strange time, isn't it? And we hope today provides some reprieve from some of the things on Earth that are concerning us right now. And there's one big one. We're very proud today to provide 45 minutes of a journey that will take you away from Earth. About 2 months ago, we named this webinar, Why Every Human Should Leave the Planet. We had no idea back then that millions of people around the globe this week might feel that urge to escape Earth. While our conversation today is about space, mostly, we're also going to gain new perspectives and some refreshing insights about Earth, which is under considerable stress at this time. We're happy that hundreds of people are joining the webinar today. We have representatives of space industry companies, higher education, media companies, technology, research, communications, space associations. We even have a noted cognitive anthropologist, all fascinated about the possibilities of space and what it offers us on Earth. We have two distinguished panelists today with us to talk about the cognitive shifts that happen when a human does leave the planet. Our first guest, Frank White, coined the term overview effect some 30 years ago to describe that experience in his books on the topic. Frank has interviewed some 40 astronauts, including several just last summer, in his own on-Earth space journey for decades. He also has interviewed our second guest, Michael López-Alegría, who flew for NASA from 1995 to 2007. He has been outside the spacecraft plenty, looking down at Earth and around the universe and billions of stars, spacewalking more than any American astronaut. Michael has spent 215 days on the International Space Station. He's an American hero. We're so proud to have you here, Michael and Frank. So let's kick back a little bit right now. Let's relax a little, enjoy a brief reprieve and some new perspectives about the world challenges. You'll have an opportunity to submit your questions in the GoToMeeting attendee control panel. If that doesn't work, you can send us an email. We'll try our best to get to many of them today, live on the call with Michael and Frank. But if not, we'll respond to you. In the coming weeks. So now let's leave the planet with Frank and Michael. Frank, you're up first.
Well, thank you, John, and welcome everybody to our webinar on the overview effect. Excuse me. I'd like to begin with a little comment about the title. It's a little different, and originally, it was why everyone should go into space. And I personally ask for a change because in all the presentations I give, I quote Bucky Fuller, and I tell people that going into space is not the accurate way to describe it. As Bucky pointed out, the Earth is in space. It has always been in space. It will always be in space, and we are already in space. So we can't go into space if we're already there. In a very real sense, we, and that means everybody here at the webinar, we are the astronauts of what Buckminster Fuller called Spaceship Earth. Now, on the other hand, leaving the planet, that's accurate. That's what astronauts like Michael actually have done. And when they do that, they achieve this remarkable new perspective on the Earth, a new worldview, a new understanding of our place in the universe. And that's what we call the overview effect. So what is the overview effect? Well, more than 3 decades ago, I coined the term overview effect to describe what happens when astronauts leave the planet and they look back. Let me put it this way, a lot happens, but a few of the most outstanding comments they make is that they're surprised they don't see borders or boundaries from a distance. They're very surprised at how thin the atmosphere is, and that's the only thing really keeping us alive. They're really struck by the beauty of our planet. And they see the planet, as in this picture, as an interconnected whole system. They see that all life on Earth is interconnected. One thing they tell me often is, we're all in this together. And it's been striking as we have faced the challenge of the coronavirus. I've started hearing public officials say that. Everybody from the Surgeon General of the United States to Bernie Sanders. So on a global level, the virus is giving a message to our leaders and to us that's not dissimilar from that of the astronauts. So let's talk a little bit about the overview effect and where we stand with this understanding. My first edition of the book on this subject, including interviews with 16 astronauts, came out in 1987. There's something about the astronaut message that keeps this book alive, even though it hasn't sold anything like New York Times bestseller sales. And it's now had 3 editions, and my interview with Michael is in the 3rd one. I urge you, if you purchase the book, to read it. So I'm working on the 4th edition now, and that's going to include interviews, as John said, with 41 astronauts, and of particular importance with future astronauts who are going to fly on Virgin Galactic or Blue Origin. I predict that one of you will be a future astronaut, and I really want to interview you before and after your flight. We now have a trilogy that includes 2 other books on the overview effect. Recently, this whole idea achieved a new milestone in the fact that I went to Johnson Space Center and interviewed 10 astronauts, and as you can see, for the first time ever, I interviewed 3 astronauts who were on the International Space Station at the time. All of the interviews were videotaped, and then 7 of the interviews were turned into really nice, understandable 3-minute explanations of the astronaut experience by the ISS communications team, and they now have it on their social media in a remarkable series. It's called Down to Earth. I urge you to go take a look. This information is available to everyone, and it might be something you could use, especially in this difficult time in your own work. It's been a big hit on social media, and when I told John about it and he took a look at it, he said, let's do a webinar on the overview effect. Let's celebrate this development. So here we are today, and I want to thank John, and I want to thank the Brodeur team for putting this on, and thank all of you for coming. We're going to look at the past of the overview effect and the experiences of professional astronauts like Michael, but we should bear in mind we're on the verge of an amazing future where hundreds and even thousands of us, again, some of us who are here today, may be experiencing the overview effect directly. So I want to turn it over to somebody who really knows what it's like, and that's Michael López-Alegría. Michael, thanks for being here today. What's it like to get ready to go into orbit and to have this experience?
Well, thanks, Frank. I'll get to that in a sec. First, I want to thank John and the team for organizing the webinar and all of the listeners for joining in. It's pretty difficult to convey the experience really without being there. I think pictures are in many ways worth 1,000 words. And so what I want to do is sort of take you up through the last day or so before the launch and the launch experience and some of the imagery that you would experience in space, and then get to the questions. So this picture is on launch morning, and what precedes the picture is a long process. It's a rigorous selection that takes almost a year, leads to joining NASA as an astronaut candidate, or ASCAN, which they like to call us. Then another year of training on spacecraft systems. So in my case, that was a space shuttle. Today, it's the International Space Station. 2 or more years more serving in a technical assignment. So that's a support role for a current or scheduled mission. And finally, assignment to a mission of your own with another year of space, of flight-specific training. And then finally, the last week of that preparation is in quarantine. We fly to Kennedy Space Center on Cape Canaveral in Florida about 3 days prior to launch. So on launch morning, we have a ceremonial breakfast. I say ceremony because nobody tends to eat or drink very much for maybe obvious reasons. Then we have a last minute medical checks, a weather briefing, and then we put on this outfit, which is a special protective piece of gear with top and bottom sort of thermal underwear that have these tubes through which water flows to keep us cool. And then the next stage is to go out to the launch pad. So this is a crew of a different flight heading out to what we call the Astro Van for the 20 or so minute ride out to the launch pad. Once we get there, we're met by a group of 6 technicians and 1 other astronaut that help us strap in. They're called the closeout crew. We ride an elevator up to what they call the 195-foot level and walk across the mobile access arm to the so-called white room, which is the end of which is nestled against the orbiter like a jet bridge positioned for boarding a commercial airplane. And one by one, we're helped putting on parachute harnesses and led into the orbiter. 4 of us go on to the flight deck, which is sort of upstairs, although it's to the right in this picture because the orbiter is in launch position, obviously, and the other 3 are what I would call downstairs in the mid deck. So the technicians help each of us get into our seats. Our backs are horizontal at this point, and our legs are slightly elevated, and they attach the harnesses to the parachute that have been pre-positioned on the backs of the seats. And then after making connections for oxygen, cooling, and communications, they move on to the next person. Once that process is complete for everybody, the closeout crew shuts and performs a leak check on the hatch and prepares a white room for launch. Once it's secure, they retreat to a safe vantage point, which is 3 miles away. So for about the next hour or so, we don't have a lot to do except we check the configuration of the literally hundreds of switches in the cockpit. We do comp checks with the launch team in Florida, the flight control team in Houston, and then there's a brief lull in the activity, and we're sort of left to contemplate what's ahead. We're sitting on about 760 tons of TNT, and they say that when a rocket is lit, there are 10,000 things that can happen, and only one of them is good, so we're hoping for that. When the countdown gets to 9 minutes, it stops and it allows a poll of the 500-member launch team. And the launch director asks the head of each discipline whether his or her system is ready to launch. And one by one, we wait to hear the word go from the various disciplines. The vehicle, the weather, the range safety system, the mission control team in Houston, the abort landing sites in Europe and in Africa, the satellite communication system in orbit, and more. And we're also asked if we're ready to go, easiest question in the world. And once the launch director says we're go for launch, the countdown is resumed and the clock moves from 900 to 859, 858, and there's really nothing like that feeling. Next, at 7 minutes 30 seconds, the orbiter access arm, or the jet bridge with the white room at the end, begins to rotate out of the way, and we can actually see that moving through the windows. At 6:15, we move switches to start the 3 rocket power auxiliary pumps that supply hydraulic fluid to move the shuttle's aerodynamic surfaces and the engine nozzles as well. At 4:55, the range safety system is armed. This is a system that would actually blow the shuttle up with the crew in it if we stray too far from our intended path during the launch sequence. At 3:55, the aerodynamic surfaces on the orbiter are moved in a pre-programmed sequence, which we can actually feel a little bit of shuddering in the vehicle itself. At 3 minutes 30 seconds, a similar check is conducted with the gimbals or the great big nozzles of the main engines on the bottom of the shuttle, and we can certainly feel that as well. At 2 minutes 50 seconds, the GOX hood, the gaseous oxygen vent hood, is moved out of the way. At 2 minutes and 30 seconds, the crew is asked to close and lock their visors and initiate oxygen flow to the helmets. At 31 seconds, control of the launch sequence passes from ground-based computers to those aboard the vehicle. At T-minus 16 seconds, the sound suppression system on the launch pad is activated, which dumps more than a million liters of water onto the flame trench at more than 50,000 liters per second to stop the vibrations and the noise. And then at 0:06.6, the start sequence of the very first liquid fuel main engine starts, and the other two follow at an intervals of 120 milliseconds. And we definitely feel them because the whole stack lurches as the engines come up to full power, while the whole vehicle is being held to the launch pad by 8 giant bolts. At T0, those explosive charges inside the nuts holding those bolts together explode, and the bolts are allowed to go free. And then simultaneously, the solid rocket boosters ignite, and we have liftoff. So when the vehicle takes off, it weighs about 4.5 million pounds, and there's about 7.5 million pounds of thrust. So that ratio is acceleration we feel, and it comes on instantaneously, about 1.5 G. But we're burning liquid propellant at 1,000 gallons per second and solid propellant at 9 tons per second. So as the weight goes down and the thrust stays about the same, the G's go up. And what you feel, in addition to a lot of vibration and noise, is nothing but huge acceleration. I mean, it just feels like somebody's pushing you faster and faster and faster. And after 2 minutes, at a speed of Mach 4 and an altitude of about 30 miles, the solid rocket boosters are spent. They're jettisoned and they land in the ocean about 100 miles offshore. And inside the cockpit, the noise and the vibration go down quite a bit. The G's reduce from about 2.5 back to just a little more than 1. But the unyielding acceleration continues, and you steadily increase force, pushing you back to go faster and faster. So we're going Mach 5 at 3 minutes, Mach 10 in 5 minutes 20 seconds, Mach 20 in 7 minutes 10 seconds. And by 8 minutes and 30 seconds, the orbiter is traveling Mach 25, which is 17,500 miles an hour, or about 5 miles per second. So the engine shut down, the G's go from 3 to 0 instantaneously. The external tank is jettisoned, and we're in orbit. And all the sensations that we feel, physiological, psychological, you just can't overstate them. Huge amounts of energy were transformed from solid and liquid propellant into that, thunderous acceleration. And then all of a sudden, you go from there to being in space. So this is a compilation of the launch sequence from Atlantis' last flight in July of 2011.
And attention all personnel, this is the NTD conducting the launch status check. Verify ready to resume count and go for launch. OTC.
OTC is go.
TBC.
Tank and booster go.
TTC.
TTC is go.
LPS.
LPS is go.
The countdown clock will resume on my mark. 3, 2, 1, mark.
T-minus 9 minutes and counting.
DLS auto sequence has been initiated. This day is
been over 30 years in the making. There have been many fabulous missions throughout the years. On behalf of KSC launch teams past and present, we salute the entire astronaut corps.
Next milestone is a check of the orbiter's flight controls.
TLS is go for purge sequence 4.
Fuel cells going to internal. External tank camera being activated at this time.
Crew OTC, close and lock your visors and initiate O2 flow.
Go for auto sequence start.
Handoff to Atlantis' computers has occurred. Go for main engine start. T-minus 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5.
Roger roll, Atlantis. Houston now controlling the flight of Atlantis. The space shuttle spreads its wings one final time for the start of a sentimental journey into history. 24 seconds into the flight, roll program complete. Atlantis now heads down, wings level on the proper alignment for its 8.5-minute ride to orbit. 4.5 million pounds of hardware and humans taking aim on the International Space Station. Now standing by for external tank separation.
So after that sort of crazy white knuckle roller coaster, there's such a contrast between that and the serenity and the peace and the tranquility of being in space. We get out of our seats and we start, we notice that everything, including us, starts floating. Motion initiated in a given direction, like by pushing off with your finger from one end of the module, just you continue going into that same thing. It's pure Newtonian motion until something gets in the way. And even like force as light as typing on a computer with your fingertips is enough to push you away from the computer. But then you get to see out the window, and the colors are just simply spectacular. You have this is a shot in the Caribbean. The turquoise color is fantastic. We see the reds of the desert. We see volcanoes, glaciers. These are thunderstorms, which look like they're stuck down to the surface of the Earth, even though when you're on the Earth looking up, they seem like they're way up there. Aurora, both at the north and south ends of our orbit. A hurricane. At the speed I mentioned, we're going around the planet every 90 minutes. So every 45 minutes, we see a sunrise or a sunset. And they're very fast, as you can imagine, but no less beautiful than on the planet Earth. What's interesting is people, despite all this beautiful nature, what people really focus on tends to be these kind of gray smudges, which are cities. They take out the long lens and they try to zoom in on the places because they're places they know, right, where they grew up or where, these significant events in history have occurred, etc. And we really are shocked at the fact that we can actually, with our naked eye, see things like runways and bridges, things that are straight, they're man-made, and so they're obviously stand out against nature. But what really strikes you as you have these experiences with all the beautiful scenery is this sort of change that comes over you. So it's not dramatic, it's pretty subtle, but it's noticeable. And the view of the Earth from the vantage point of space, of the places where the entirety of human history has occurred, seems to give you a different perspective and sort of the literal and figurative meaning of the word. And when you see this view, you know, a world without political boundaries, you don't hear gunshots of war. Like the cities that I mentioned look kind of like smudges. They seem rather insignificant when you're viewing from this far with your naked eye. And regional problems and quarrels, they seem, you know, kind of petty. You don't see poverty, you don't see hunger, you don't see religious and ethnic intolerance. And so it gives you this sense that Frank, I think, very aptly called the overview effect, a sense of, you know, greater connectedness to both the people on the planet and even the planet itself. When you look at the atmosphere horizontally, you realize just how thin it is. In fact, if the Earth were the size of an apple, the atmosphere is about the thickness of the skin of that apple. And that's all that protects us from the cold void of space. So to close, I'd say, you know, to date, about 560 people in the history of humanity have ever had that privilege of seeing the view and experiencing the overview effect. And there are commercial space companies like Virgin Galactic, Blue Origin, and others that are trying to change that. And I think it's reasonable that in the next 10 years, we'll double that number and maybe double it again in the following handful of years after that. And gradually, with more and more people who have the means and influence in the world, who are the folks that are buying those tickets, having had the benefit of the experience, I truly think the world will be a better place.
Michael, this is John Brodeur. That was fascinating, and we so appreciate that description, and those visuals are just stunning. We're going to now have Frank White, who is a professional interviewer of astronauts. We're getting questions in, but he's got some of his own, and we're going to also look at some of those coming in from the audience. Even though it says on your screen 101, we're maxed out at 101. We're over 300 people that just heard Michael and Frank describe what happens in the overview effect. So we're very proud about that. Frank, why don't you go ahead and fire away some questions to Michael, and we'll see if we can squeeze some more in at the end. Again, thank you. Go ahead, Frank.
Okay, John, thank you very much. We thought we'd give you a little sense of what it's like to create the information that went into my book, which I have to say, everything I know comes from talking to astronauts like Michael. So we'll give you a little sense of what that kind of interview looks like. Michael, you know, being an astronaut is not a traditional profession. I always want to ask people, when did you first decide I want to be an astronaut?
Well, I'm sure we all have different answers. A lot of my colleagues have had this dream since birth, or maybe even since conception. For me, it was a little bit later. I was 11 when Apollo 11 landed on the moon, and I remember being at the beach with my parents and some friends, and at a certain point, the parents started calling the kids out of the water, and nobody really knew what was going on. And we all huddled around our transistor radios laying on the beach towels, and we could hear the final moments of the descent to the lunar surface. And then these adults started hugging each other and slapping each other on the back, like, you know, they were complete strangers, but they acted like they were family. And that was a really powerful view for a kid my age. So that's kind of when it started. It went dormant sort of in high school and even in college at the Naval Academy, but I ended up being a Navy pilot. I studied engineering. I wanted to combine those two worlds, and that's what test pilots do. So I picked up a magazine about the U.S. Naval Test Pilot School, and there was a sidebar about all the graduates who had gone on to become astronauts, and there was like a who's who. It was everybody, all the names that I was familiar with. And that's kind of when the dream was reborn at age 25.
That's really impressive that it started early and then went away for a while and then came back. I've heard that before as well. You've talked a lot about the overview effect very beautifully. I just want to ask a quick question. What was it like that first moment when you saw the Earth from orbit?
Well, as you can imagine, we train a lot before the flight, and we talk to people who have been to space, and we see images taken from space. And so to some degree, we're probably more prepared than the average person would be. But I think what surprised me was the degree to which I was still surprised. I mean, it's just so beautiful and so, I mean, it looks like a globe, again, without the boundaries. And so it looks exactly like you would expect it to look, but it's still surprising. I mean, it's just such a magical experience. And combined with floating and the launch experience, all that together really makes it be an indescribable feeling.
Yeah, a lot of astronauts talk about the difference between the idea of seeing the Earth from a distance and actually experiencing it, and I think you've just captured that. One thing a lot of people want to know is, did the experience change over time? You've had a lot of flights so far, and one question is, this is a picture of the shuttle. How were shuttle missions different from when you had more time on the International Space Station?
They're very different. They're often compared to the difference between a sprint and a marathon, and I think that's a pretty apt description. In a shuttle, you're pretty much heads down, pedaling as fast as you can for however long it is, usually about 2 weeks. We get half a day off halfway through the mission or so. You can't maintain that pace on a 6-month ISS mission, so we end up living a lot more like we do on Earth. We work sort of Monday through Friday and half a day Saturday for house cleaning. We wake up at a given hour, we go to bed at a given hour. So it's a completely different feeling, and that's not so much just working in space. It's really living in space. And of course, we have a lot more window time. And I think the intensity of the feelings that you have that we call the overview effect are heightened by having that extra time in which to contemplate and think about life.
So it never gets boring, would you say?
Surprisingly, it never did. I mean, I did 3 shuttle flights, and I thought of myself much more of a sprinter than a marathon runner. But I was completely satisfied and involved through the whole mission. I never got bored. I didn't have a calendar on the wall with X's through the dates. Only sort of toward the very end, when I knew I was coming home on a certain day, did I start looking, like a human nature would have you look towards something that you're anticipating. But it was never boring, and I never really longed to come back before it was time.
There is another kind of experience you can have, which is actually to go outside of the spacecraft or outside of the International Space Station. What is that like? You've done it more than any other American. What is it like to essentially be out there as a satellite of the Earth yourself?
I hope I've conveyed the magnificence of the experience to fly to space, but I have to say that doing a spacewalk magnifies that even greater. I mean, you said it. You're a human satellite, completely self-contained, with freedom of mobility. You're going 5 miles a second over the ground, at an altitude of 250 miles or so, and yet you're not frightened. It's just amazing, and all those sort of zoomed out aspects of looking at the Earth. And I do want to point out that we're not out there to look at the Earth. We're usually out there to do a very time-sensitive task. But when you do get a chance to sort of look over your shoulder and see the view, it's way more spectacular because, first of all, you have, literally a 360 view. There's nothing between you and the void except a thin polycarbonate visor for your helmet. And so it's an amazingly immersive experience.
I think I can imagine people are now calling up Virgin Galactic and Blue Origin to see if they can get aboard. These descriptions are great. You commented a little bit on the future as people like us begin to get this experience. You said you thought the world would be a better place. Is that because you think when people come back, they're going to have a different view and they're going to act on that different view?
Exactly. Everybody who's been in space, with a few exceptions, to date has been a professional who, spent their career and their professional lives toward that goal. I think we're going to see a new group of folks who are able to go because they've done well in their own professions. And so that means that they have certain influence and certain means. And if that group is armed with the knowledge and this sensation of the greater perspective that you get, I think you'll see them able to, influence things much better than a professional astronaut can. And so I do think it'll lead, obviously it's not going to happen overnight, but I do think you'll see the world become a better place because of it.
And does life on Earth look different to you now that you've seen the planet from orbit?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, of course, you have no control, right? I don't have a control subject that hasn't been to space that I could compare myself to, but my sense is that I am definitely a little more thoughtful, more tolerant, and more concerned about the planet. And these are aspects that I think if we're spread out to the population at large would make us all, sort of move in the direction of making the Earth better. So I'm all in favor of what we've begun to call the democratization of access to space. And it's going to be baby steps. It's incredibly expensive to do still, but much like commercial aviation was in the 20s and 30s in the U.S., only very, very wealthy people could afford to fly in airplanes. Now people get on an airplane to go to a birthday party without thinking about it. And I think that the shape of that curve is similar. Costs are going to come down as we get better at it, as reusability becomes a bigger and more economically favorable factor. And then this movement will become, almost a revolution.
I think that's what we're hoping for, and they call it the overview effect movement. I think that's what we're hoping is going to happen. Not just that a lot of people will have an amazing experience, but they're going to bring it back and do something with it back here on planet Earth. And right now, we can definitely see we need that kind of mentality. Hey, finally, you're a consultant now in your post-astronaut life, and you're working with an interesting company called Axiom. Just read that they're going to be sending 4 people to the International Space Station on a SpaceX Dragon spacecraft. Could you tell us about the purpose of that mission and what it all means that this is happening?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for asking. So Axiom's goal is actually to build a commercial space station to succeed the ISS. The ISS has a finite life, and sometime this decade probably that life will end. And in the meantime, the participating agencies are still going to want a place to go to continue the research and other activities that they're doing. So Axiom aims to provide that platform by attaching some modules to the existing ISS, and then once the ISS is going to be deorbited, separating, becoming a free-flying destination. With companies like SpaceX and Boeing provide the crew transportation, and SpaceX and Northrop Grumman providing cargo transportation, soon to be joined by Sierra Nevada. We're hoping to develop a whole ecosystem in low Earth orbit and let the government agencies spend the national treasures on going back to the moon, onto Mars, and other destinations. And so this mission, taking 4 people to the ISS itself, serves a couple of functions. One, it helps us develop the market, because part of what we want to do with the commercial space station, in addition to serving professional astronauts, is to serve private astronauts. And the second one is to get us more experience with operations, get NASA and the other international partners comfortable with our operations by practicing, if you will, a few times. So we plan 1 or 2 private and or professional astronauts per year, between 2021 and the first launch, the launch of our first module, which we hope will be in 2024. And then we'll continue while we're jointly docked. And then when we separate, we'll take the other customers as well as the ones that we've developed in the meantime.
So we can really see that private activity in space is going to accelerate, and that's just one example of it. So, Michael, thank you so much. As you know, I could talk to you and I could talk to astronauts all day, but I think we want to get to some questions from the participants who are here with us today in the webinar. Thanks a lot.
This is John Brodeur again. Thank you. We have several questions. Should mention that several of Michael's colleagues at Axiom are in the audience today, and so we're talking to some future astronauts as well. The first question is to Michael, and then the last question, because we're not going to have a lot of time. We only have 3 or 4 more minutes. But the first question, Michael, is to you, and then we'll then we'll have one for both Frank and Michael, and then we'll say goodbye. Michael, the overall or overview effect, how has it affected your treatment of the environment? Not your treatment, but how's your view of the environment changed with the overview effect? That's one question.
I kind of alluded to it in the presentation, but I think you're really struck when you're in space, again, looking at the thickness or rather thinness of the atmosphere, that that's all that's protecting us. I mean, when you're outside in a spacesuit, you're subject to temperatures that range in a 45-minute period from minus 100 to plus 150 degrees centigrade. You're exposed to radiation, you're exposed to micrometeorite perils, and when you're on Earth, we don't have those problems, and we don't because of our atmosphere. So it's not a very difficult calculation to realize it, is we need to protect our atmosphere. And when you hear about what's the drivers of climate change, they're basically assaults on the composition of our atmosphere. So it's pretty easy to draw a line between the dots and make you more aware of the importance of protecting it and the fragility of the ecosystem underneath it.
Thank you. And this is for both of you. Frank, if you could answer first, and we're going to ask briefly for both of you. There's a question from someone who says, hey, this overview effect, we want some of that, but we want some of that if we're not astronauts. How does it work on Earth? How do we transfer some of those feelings, some of those insights, some of those aspirations? How do we move overview effect within ourselves here on Earth?
Thanks, John. Well, there is a movement called Bringing the Overview Effect Down to Earth. And to be honest, there are people all over the planet trying to answer the question you asked. I will just say that many of us think the most promising short-term approach is going to be using virtual reality. And if we had time, I could give you a list of all the different people who are doing their best to give the astronaut experience to those of us who are still here on the surface. And I just think that this is going to be one of many promising efforts to do it. And for others, there are plenty of YouTube videos available right now today about the overview effect. So go take a look.
Or go to Amazon and get Frank's book.
That helps, yeah.
I had to plug your book, Frank. I hope you don't mind.
Thank you, John.
And Michael, same question, sir. The overview effect and moving it to Earth.
Well, I guess in the end, I agree. You know, it's a very sensory experience, and the first degree of the transmission of the experience is if you hear somebody talk about it, but it gets better if you see the imagery, if you can feel the vibrations, if you can hear the noise. Ultimately, you probably even want to taste the food, right, and smell the smell of space, so to speak. But all those combine to be a very visceral sensation, and the degree to which we can replicate that, I think, is improving greatly. You know, first we had books, and then we had movies, and then we had IMAX, and now we have virtual reality and augmented reality. So that progression, if it continues, could potentially someday get there. Although I don't know if it'll ever quite get there. I mean, it's a pretty special thing, and I would think hard to replicate exactly. But I do think we should continue to try for all the reasons that we discussed before about making the world a better place.
That's terrific, and I just want to close this terrific session on this webinar today. And thanks to Michael, our astronaut, and Frank, our space philosopher. And thank you to all the 300 plus attendees. It was a fascinating glimpse. I hope everyone agrees, and I'm sure you will, the space travel and also the travel that's here on Earth right now and how space can benefit us. Space expands us. I think we heard a lot today. It's unlimited on what it can teach us and how it can bring Earth even more together. And as Frank said, and as we're hearing a lot right now with COVID-19, that we are all in this together and on this planet, and working together, we can learn a lot from space, and we can learn a lot from what happens on Earth, and bringing those two together can do a lot of good and benefit. So again, thanks to everybody for your time and attention today. Send questions to us, and we'll try to get back in touch with you. And for now,